Are killer robots the future of war? More technically known as lethal autonomous weapon systems, or LAWs, these robots can operate independently and attack targets without human control. Artificial intelligence weapons have already been deployed in military conflict, but some warn the war in Ukraine could see both sides using autonomous weapons in an unprecedented way. Despite UN-led attempts to curb development and establish international regulation of laws, countries, including the U.S. and Russia, are continuing their unchecked development of the technology. Human rights organizations are campaigning against killer robots, while some military experts argue that they'll make war safer and more efficient. Are they right? And are we witnessing the dawn of a new arms race? Joining me to discuss this are Laura Nolan, a former Google employee and software engineer with the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, and Matt Mahmoudi, an artificial intelligence researcher with Amnesty International. Good to see both of you. Thank you for joining me. Laura, I'm going to start with you. The evolution of killer robots has been described as a, quote, potentially seismic event in warfare, akin to the invention of gunpowder and nuclear bombs. That's a rather staggering characterization. Is it one you'd agree with?
It absolutely is not. I mean, the invention of gunpowder is something that has actually pretty much formed the whole nature of the nation state and the whole way that we live. I don't think that AI weapons are likely to be that seismic. I mean, I think looking at the current context, we're living in a world where people are building these complex AI weapons, which are unproven, and their utility and their efficacy is completely unproven. I do think that autonomous weapons are likely to pose danger, both to soldiers themselves. I think there's a very, very high risk of friendly fire type incidents. I think there's a high risk of civilian harm. I think there's a very high risk of potentially sparking off a conflict in an unintentional kind of way.
Matt, I want to pivot to you for a second. In terms of the technology of war, are we now going to see a race to see who can build the biggest and most efficient and most destructive killer robot?
I do think it's important to note that states are, of course, in competition with each other around autonomous weapon systems. I mean, in January 2021 alone, we've seen Enivision Rafael advanced defense systems building and showcasing commercial drones and robot dogs capable of facial recognition. We've seen in Libya in March 2020 the use of various cargo drones, which have been developed by Turkey. We've seen a number of cases in which technologies that are autonomous weapon systems, by definition, are being used. However, with that said, the form of the arms race might look quite different to what we're expecting. A lot of the technologies that autonomous weapon systems are built on are technologies that are being used in everyday contexts, in the policing context, for example. Facial recognition for mass surveillance, emotion recognition, gait recognition, predictive analytics. These are all tools that we know are being used against, for example, Black Lives Matter protesters, and have been known to time and time again fail and to augment racially discriminatory policing, and are de facto against international human rights law. So if we're looking for that one Terminator to show up at our door, we're maybe looking in the wrong place, and I'd argue that what we're actually needing to sort of keep an eye out for are these more mundane ways in which these technologies are starting to play a role in our everyday lives and govern how we live.
And it seems to me that a big part of that is the growing partnerships between these tech companies and governments. Laura, you worked as an engineer for Google before resigning in 2018 out of protest after you were assigned to work on Project Maven, which seeks to advance drone technology for the U.S. military. In recent years, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have all signed contracts with the Pentagon, while others, including Elon Musk, have pledged not to develop lethal autonomous weapons. How dangerous are these partnerships, particularly in light of the fact that these companies have the personal information of more than 1 billion people around the world?
I think I would like to underline what Matt just said, which is that these are not only military technologies. There are huge implications here for civil liberties, for privacy, and for how we live our lives outside of a warfare context as well. So fundamentally, when you're talking about autonomous weapons, if you want to blow up a bridge, you don't really need an autonomous weapon. Autonomous weapons are fundamentally about targets that are mobile. They're not for attacking military bases. They're not for attacking tank columns. They're about people. They are about people and vehicles that have people in them. And therefore, these kinds of weapons, they're very intimately bound up in surveillance technologies, because you need to have an autonomous weapon, you need to have technology to know where people are moving around, to understand their behavior. So where big tech comes into this is, if you think about cloud computing technology, you have big companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google. They're making a lot of money out of selling commodity cloud computing technology. Now, surveillance technology is hugely compute intensive. So quite simply, it takes a lot of CPU cycles, a lot of memory, a lot of expensive computing infrastructure to run this kind of technology. So there's a huge business opportunity here to build surveillance systems. And I think we can see that borne out in the fact that all of the major cloud companies have built APIs for recognizing objects, for recognizing people. This is, as I say, this is very much dual-use technology between military and civilian applications.
Matt, let me ask you a question about precision here. U.S. airstrikes are notoriously imprecise. They've killed thousands of civilians. For example, there was a drone strike in rural Yemen in 2013 that killed at least a dozen people at a wedding procession, all civilians, according to human rights groups. A 2016 U.S. airstrike in northern Syria killed at least 120 civilians. Could AI technology at least reduce deadly incidents like this?
Absolutely not. Humans are not just numbers. And I think these systems do process human beings as if they were. We know from research that Joy Buolamwini and Temnit Gebru did a while ago that in many cases, facial recognition systems are incapable of identifying, especially Black women, with a rate of anywhere between 60 to 70 to sometimes 90%, depending on the study that you look at. Now, even if you were to make those systems 99% accurate, let's say that you could, you're still dealing with systems that are inherently existing in a context of discrimination, institutional racism, misogyny, etc. And so I think it's important that we look.
But Matt, how would that be different than the current systems of policing or surveillance or education or anything else we have?
So it would double down and augment those existing crises and those existing forms of discrimination, right? So we don't want to have a system in which, say, you have these discriminatory practices and put them on steroids. That's exactly the opposite of what we want to do. And so what we need is, in fact, a legally binding instrument, which is what the Stop Killer Robots campaign has been calling for. And what we need is also a global ban on remote biometric surveillance technologies, which figure into these autonomous weapon systems.
I did want to make a quick point regarding what Matt said before about the dangers of accountability and regulation, and why it makes a difference that we might take an imperfect process that is executed by human beings and automate it. So one of the great problems that we have, I guess, with both preserving our civil rights in a free society and also with overseeing international humanitarian law and ensuring that the international laws of warfare are respected, is that we have a lack of transparency. And one of the things that we see is when we automate a process, we, as Matt says, we make it less flexible, and we also tend to make it much less transparent. If we start taking the logic of what we're doing in warfare or in our society, and we start encoding it in algorithms and processes that are very inscrutable, that can be inspected by few people, that are controlled by a few people, then we do risk things spinning out of control in ways that we do not want.
Laura, there's also an argument to be made that it's too late, right? The most powerful nations are supporting this stuff. The technologies are already in use. U.S. National Security Commission co-chair Robert Work said AI in warfare is already happening. So if it's already happening, and again, the most powerful people are behind it, what do we do? Is it too late?
I think that is a very, very nihilistic kind of approach to take to it. If you look at nuclear weapons, they were used in 1945 and they haven't been used since. So it's possible to refrain from the use of certain weapons. As regards development, there has also been a very, very strong norm has emerged against chemical weapons and also biological weapons. And of course, there's a very, very strong emerging norm against the use of landmines because of the harm that they do to civilians. So I think it's I don't think it's correct to say that there's no hope. that weapons are never banned, or that states never refrain from using particular types of weapons.
Matt?
It's never too late, but we have to put human beings and not data points ahead of the agenda. And as we've seen time and time again with even issues of tech, as soon as enough people are aware of the kinds of harms these systems are causing, they will inevitably move the needle on what is seen as permissible. And what we need to do in this particular moment is move the needle on how permissible we're finding autonomous weapon systems. And as you know, from where we're standing, it's absolutely unacceptable.
Laura, Matt, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront. All right, that is our show. UpFront will be back next week.